So Dr. Wallis holds a joint appointment with the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill. She's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London. Specialization time period before 1800. Dr. Wallis teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses in the history of medicine, ancient medicine, medieval medicine, and general medieval medicine. And as I told you, in infectious diseases, it's extremely important for us. I mean, the history of medicine is key in terms of understanding the way epidemics, played out in the world. So, Dr. Wallis, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Drs. Rosenberg and Schlick for inviting me to be part of this workshop today. When Thomas Schlick first invited me, I said, well, no, wait, this is a workshop on disintermediation. If you want me to talk about the world I know, which is the world of medieval Europe, we're talking about pre-intermediation. And he said, that's exactly the point. I want you to talk about how an entire healthcare system was created with doctors on the borders. And he told me also to assume no prior knowledge of the Middle Ages or of medieval medicine on the part of the audience. And I know that's not the case. We have people like Mary Earle here and Olivia Weiser who know a great deal about medieval medicine. So forgive me if I'm telling you an awful lot of stuff that you already know and blame it on Thomas. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that hospitals in Western Europe are invented in the Middle Ages, as are universities, as are university-trained doctors, as is the notion of a medical profession. These are all medieval inventions. None of this existed in the ancient world. And medicine plays a central role in the hospital, in the evolution of the hospital, but doctors are on the borders. Now, this image that you see on the screen is a hospital, though it may look more like the interior of a church to you. The resemblance was deliberate, and as we'll see, the image is quite realistic. That's what medieval hospitals looked like. The image obviously shows patients in their beds, and they're surrounded by the people who are caring for them. On the right, you can see a priest who is hearing confession. Walking down the aisle behind the priest are two laymen, probably merchants or wealthy members of the city community, probably members of a confraternity, which is a kind of lay religious club dedicated to good works, or sort of like the Rotarians or the Knights of Columbus of their day. They donated to, they also oversaw the hospital. The most prominent people, though, in terms of size and position, are the two nursing sisters in the front, who are sewing the body of a dead patient into a shroud. They are fulfilling the last of the works of mercy, which is to give a decent burial to the dead. Can anybody find the doctor? Is there a doctor in the house?
Probably not. The guy with the urine is tasting it.
Yes, good. He's on the border. He's almost outside the picture. So there's a physician with his urine flask called a matula or a Jordan. This is a diagnosis from the visual inspection of urine in a glass carafe type vessel was a standard practice inherited from ancient medicine. You find it in Galen and Hippocrates. There's also pulse diagnosis. But anyway, the doctor is, you can't, it's really the symbol of the doctor is the urine flask. He's present, but he's by no means central. He's an accessory figure. He's not the dominant figure. The dominant figure are the two nursing sisters in the front. Now, for the modern viewer, this hardly seems normal, let alone an ideal image of a hospital. But for medieval people, it was both normal and ideal. Because in the Middle Ages, a hospital is primarily a space. It's a space for charitable care. It's for charitable care of persons, that is, both their body and their soul. And these persons were impoverished and destitute. The hospital was for the charitable care of the poor. An important but not exclusive element of that charity was the provision of health care. And the doctor in this picture symbolizes that provision. And I'm going to say symbolizes because the actual care might not have been given by a doctor, and in fact, in most cases, probably wasn't given by a doctor. But a university-trained professional physician stood or symbolized the best medical care available, the gold standard medical care of the Middle Ages. And it was this that the hospital aspired, in theory, to give. So if that is the case, why is the doctor there, and why is he on the border? Now, I hope to at least explore this question in 7 steps, plus a conclusion. First, I'm going to sketch the historical context of medieval medicine, emphasizing the watershed around the year 1100, when a new type of hospital and a new type of medicine, academic medicine, taught in universities, came into being. The eminent English historian of medieval hospitals, Peregrine Horton, has put forward the argument that academic medicine and the new hospitals are closely intertwined thanks to an old notion inherited from Galen of the non-naturals. Now, what are the non-naturals? The non-naturals are the environmental and behavioral factors that can turn health into illness and can turn illness into health. They are things like food and drink, exercise and rest, retention and elimination, the air you breathe, and even the emotions you feel. Horton argues that medieval hospital medicine was non-naturals medicine, and as such, it was gold standard academic medicine, but medicine without doctors. And I want to nuance Horton's position by looking at a hospital that was actually famous for having doctors, the Great Hospital of Jerusalem, and a hospital that had no doctors, St Bartholomew's of London. Now, what's interesting in these two apparently opposite cases illustrates, in fact, the same principle. Learned, scientific, academic medicine is the best medicine in the view of medieval people. But doctors are inherently a problem in an institution that is dedicated to the charitable care of the poor. Now, my slides compared with Jeremy Green's are distinctly steampunk, as you can see, but this is my conventional timeline of the Middle Ages with the conventional divisions into early, central, and later Middle Ages. But below that, you can see really the watershed of the history of medicine and hospitals. And that watershed is really around the year 1100. The 12th to the 14th century, and that's the area with the big star there. On both sides of this watershed, we're dealing with a tradition of rational medicine that's derived from ancient Greece and Rome. I'm going to call this secular medicine, as distinct from, say, miraculous healing, which is nothing to do with hospitals and is usually recorded in not as medicine, but as hagiography. Now, it's important to remember 2 things. First of all, in the classical world, in the ancient world, there was no generalized institutional training for doctors and no systems of medical certification or licensing. These are medieval inventions, and they're inventions that come after 1100. It's important also to remember that both ancient physicians and their medieval counterparts worked in a free market economy. They earned their living by charging for their treatments on the open market. Now, the difference between the medieval medicine and the later medieval medicine can be summed up on 2 points. First of all was the unprecedented access to the ancient heritage of medical knowledge, especially what was called medical theory, anatomy, physiology, etiology, theory of pathology, things like that happens around the year 1100 with the translation from Greek and Arabic of many important medical texts that were hitherto inaccessible in the West because they were all in Greek, and the language of record in early medieval Europe was Latin. And the second point is a medieval revolution in medical education and the medical profession. As urban life declined in the West in late antiquity, we're looking here at the early medieval period, so did the number of trained professional physicians, and so did access to the theoretical literature of ancient Greek medicine, all of which was in Greek, not in Latin, and there's more political disruption and cultural disintegration in Western Europe in the early Middle Ages. Essentially, Greek texts are inaccessible, they're unavailable to people whose literary language is Latin. But medicine went on. Practical secular medicine could in many cases be practiced by people with experience and craft training, and I'm going to call them medics rather than physicians. Physician is a word that comes into being with the advent of university medicine. We can also use the code word here, monastic medicine, not because it all takes place in monasteries, but because people without an extensive scientific background and working in an unprofessionalized environment are doing most of the medicine in this period. And the big shift, as I said, occurs around 1100. Why does this shift happen? First of all, there's an enormous economic and population takeoff after about 1100. Growth of cities, new cities, as well as the sort of reinhabitation of old ones, a new commercial economy, a new monetary economy, and money is a big issue in the 12th century, a hot button issue. At the same time, there's a sweeping reform of religion. There's a reform of the church, but above all, a great change in piety. This has been called the medieval Reformation, and it's characterized by the expanding demand of lay people for opportunities while living in the world to earn religious merit, and in particular, to find a way to sanctify the new wealth that they are gaining from commercial activities. There's also, at this time, a demand for educated men to serve in the expanding bureaucracies of church and state, and the result is an explosion of schools, the most important of which would federate into universities around the end of the 12th century. And this is a very significant medieval innovation. The university is it's Europe's first permanent academic corporation in charge of higher learning, and of course it's still with us now. Now, one of the most extraordinary aspects of this unprecedented development was the incorporation of medicine into the university as a learned discipline. This was driven by the recovery of ancient Greek medical science, especially that theoretical medicine, along with its revolutionary systematization and development thanks to the work of Arab Islamic physicians. And the result was the transformation of medicine itself into a self-consciously learned profession. As well, this sort of feeds back because the more discretionary income there is available in these new cities, the more demand there is for medical services at the high end, especially in cities and courts. Now, all of this is happening with the endorsement and encouragement of the church. But I want to point out that Christian tradition carries some ambivalent baggage about secular doctors and their medicine. The miracles recorded of Jesus of Nazareth were overwhelmingly miracles of healing, and these are especially plentiful in the Gospel of Luke. Luke was traditionally supposed to be a physician. The story of the healing of the woman with the issue of blood is the only one that mentions secular doctors, and the reference isn't particularly complimentary. Doctors are implicitly criticized as venal and incompetent and exploitative. The story is that this woman basically had a hemorrhage. She had a period that lasted for 12 years. And she had spent everything she had on doctors, but was no better, but was only worse, and she is miraculously healed by touching Jesus's robe. So although Luke doesn't lay it on with a trowel here, you can kind of get the message that doctors they're in it for the money. They exploit the sufferings of sick people. They will continue to build hope while picking their pockets, and ultimately, in many cases, they will not do any good. So there's a little bit of a critique of doctors here. On the other hand, Jesus also tells the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, which illustrates the value of secular medical skill. Now, the story is that a man is going from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he gets mugged by a bunch of robbers, and he's wounded and left dead on the road, and the only person who stops to help him is a Samaritan. And what the Samaritan does is apply practical first aid based on secular medical principles. He pours oil and wine into his wounds. The oil is supposed to soothe the wounds, and the wine is supposed to, of course, cleanse it. And he does this without remuneration. To the contrary, he takes the man to an inn, and he pays the innkeeper to hire a nurse to take care of the man, and he promises that on his way back, he will pay the innkeeper any money that's owing. This is Christ's model of charity. Competent medical practice, but without a profit motive. Now, the hospitals before the academic turn of the 11th century, to some degree, embody this idea of charity, but in other respects don't. There are no hospitals at all in the classical Greco-Roman world, with the exception of Roman army barracks, which in many cases had a valetudinarium or a sick bay for the soldiers. The first hospitals in the Mediterranean world are Christian creations. They're created in the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, usually by Christian bishops. Basil of Caesarea was supposed to be the first in the 4th century who did this, they created institutions called a xenodochium. Xenodochium means a house for the guest or the stranger, and its Latin equivalent is hospitium, a house for the stranger or the guest. It was a caritative infrastructure for the new Christian city, and it provided shelter, above all, for the homeless. The homeless could be the traveler, the destitute poor, and so on and so forth. It also provided for the necessities of these people, including their medical necessities. The other place you'd find a quasi-hospital in the early Middle Ages is in a monastery. A monastery is very much, especially in the West, especially in the Benedictine tradition, is very much a self-sufficient, or it's designed as a self-sufficient community, and the ideal monastery would have a separate hospital wing, as it were, for sick monks. This picture that you see here is in fact the picture of an ideal monastery. It was created around the year 820, 830. It's the so-called Plan of St. Gall. And while it doesn't represent any actual real monastery, it shows what people thought the best monastery should look like. The hospitium is now a hostel for travelers. It is separated from the infirmarium, which is sort of the valetudinarium for the monks, which includes a house for a medic. We don't know what the status of that medic was, but he would have his own quarters with a kind of intensive care unit for very sick patients. There would be a herb garden, and there would also be a special installation for bloodletting, which again is another medical procedure inherited from ancient Hippocratic and Galenic medicine, used both for therapeutic and prophylactic purposes. The new houses, the new monasteries, the new hospitals of post-11th century Europe, however, are very different places. Because the motivation for building and supporting hospitals changed. The social changes that were wrought by commercial wealth in Western cities spawned an awful lot of anxiety about the spiritually corrosive effects of money. And you can see this in the replacement of pride, which used to be the worst of the deadly sins, with avarice. And this picture from a Psalter, from an illuminated book of Psalms, shows the difference between avarice, hoarding its money in chests, and charity, giving money to the poor and the crippled at the door, and also taking care of the sick. The antidote to avarice is charity. Now, what constitutes charity is again laid out in the New Testament, this time in Christ's parable of the Last Judgment, the separation of the sheep and the goats. Those who help the distressed and destitute will merit salvation, because to help the poor is to help Jesus himself. And how do you help him? You give food when he's hungry, you give him drink when he's thirsty, you welcome in the stranger, you clothe the naked, you visit the sick, and you help those who are imprisoned. So these deeds of assistance were later codified into the 7 acts or 7 works of mercy, and they became embedded in confessors' manuals and sermons in the 12th century onwards as exactly what Christian charity consisted of. They're Jesus' 6 plus an extra 7th to bury the dead. Now, this resulted in the foundation throughout Europe, in cities big and small, of multiple places, often called God's House, the Hotel Dieu. And God's House is a different kind of hospital. It is a space for the provision of charity to the poor, often created by the donation of, and supported by the donation of wealthy individuals in the community. Who are the poor? Well, they're the old poor, the destitute, the disabled, the sick, whether acute or chronic, lepers, blind, infirm, the insane, the aged, the dying, but they had to be like without resources. Other people were taken care of in their homes. They could be temporarily homeless people, like pilgrims, who were in need, orphans or abandoned children, unwed mothers or widows who had no resources, poor students. Many hospitals in, say, the city of London in the Middle Ages were actually dormitories and scholarship schools for poor students. They could be old age homes for priests who were very old or were gone blind and they had no benefits. And they could even help out respectable people who'd fallen in hard times. In other words, being poor was a kind of moving goalpost depending on where in the social ladder you were born. So a hospital, as Dr. Rice pointed out, means an awful lot of things. It could be a hostel, a hospice, an almshouse, a retirement home, a homeless shelter, a school, and also a hospital. But regardless of the profile of the hospital services, it represented what could be called a reciprocal economy of charity. The wealthy, like this guy with the fur collar and the fur hat, could disinfect their wealth by donating to the hospital. He is a member of the Confraternity of St. Anthony, and you can tell because he has this T-shaped, tau-shaped cross around his neck. There's a whole network of Antonite hospitals, especially in eastern France. And the confraternities were basically the wealthy lay people who raised money for the hospital. Now, and he got benefits too, because since the people in the hospital, not only the caregivers but also the patients, would pray for their benefactors. It was the condition of admission to the hospital that you should pray for the benefactor. And since God is especially attentive to the prayers of the poor, the benefactors receive as well as give. The Hotel Dieu in Paris is an interesting instance where we have some documents showing how the hospital as a space of reciprocal charity applied to the caregivers in the hospital as well, too. The illustration here is from a poem called The Book of the Active Life of the Hotel Dieu, which was written for the nursing sisters, the dedicated religious women who ran the great hospital of Paris, by a man named Jean-Henri, who died in 1482, and who was a canon of Notre Dame, and he was a member of the King's Council, and he was also the proviseur, or external financial overseer of the Hotel Dieu. And this book that he wrote for the nuns is a series of allegories in which the hospital symbolizes the church and the church symbolizes the hospital and so on and so forth. And it's illustrated. And in this opening illustration, you can see the two doors of charity. One is the passive charity, where the portress is admitting a poor patient who's arriving on the equivalent of a stretcher there. And the other is the door of active charity, where a young novice who's going to be trained as a nursing sister is being received. And the reciprocity between the caregiver and the cared for is emphasized by the symmetry of this picture. The poem also reveals to us how the nuns do all of what we would call the medical work of the hospital, including the diagnosis and the treatment. There is the nun in charge of the door, accompanies the sick and knows at a glance and discerns all of the types and qualities of the sick and assigns them to dedicated wards. There's a ward for the acute, a ward for the chronic, and a ward for unwed mothers. The sisters also prepare and minister all the drugs and even do surgery, especially the treatment of wounds. There are functionally distinct wards in this hospital. Including a ward for birthing mothers. But there's an awful lot of emphasis, too, on the duty of the nursing sisters to keep the place clean and to take care of the non-naturals, to take care of the dirt in the hospital, to watch over the accounts, and above all, to do the laundry. Jean-Henri says that they wash something like 500 sheets a week in the hospital. There's no mention of doctors. And yet the arrangement of the hospitals and the activity of the nuns are deeply influenced by contemporary academic medicine. So we have to understand a bit about the academic turn. Now, university medicine is rapidly accepted by medieval society after the 12th century as the gold standard. And the idea of university medicine is that it's medicine based on a mastery of ancient medical theory as systematized by the Arabs. In other words, a mastery of anatomy and physiology and the theory of pharmacy and the theory of pathology and so on and so forth. The idea that the best treatment rests on a thorough knowledge of the principles of medical science is embraced everywhere. But this medical knowledge is by no means a monopoly of university-trained medical men. It is, in fact, accessible to anybody who could read Latin, and very quickly, anybody who could read a vernacular language as well, too, as many of these university-trained manuals were translated into French and English and Italian and other languages. Nonetheless, the university stands the academic medicine stands as the cornerstone of what was seen as being gold standard medicine of the time. And what it certainly did was cement physicians for the first time in Western history into a self-conscious professional identity built around their academic training. These are the locations of the major medical universities in high medieval Europe. There's a bit of a difference between northern and southern universities, but they're complementary. In the north, the model is Paris, for example, where medicine slips in because it's seen as being a part of philosophy. It's a philosophy of the body. It's part of natural philosophy. Hence the name physician, which has nothing to do actually with being a doctor. A physicus is a student of natural science. Okay? But their doctors are pleased to start calling themselves physici because it emphasizes their scientific training. In the south, the major medical university is Bologna, where medicine slips in as a kind of companion profession to law, which is the premier subject at Bologna University. So doctors are being identified as a parallel learned profession. Now, the basis of all of this is medical theory, and I'm not going to try to give you a whole sweeping lecture on medieval medical theory. I'm going to start with just one book, but it was Medicine 101. It was the first book that you would read as a medical student, and this is Galen's book called The Art of Medicine. The Art of Medicine is a summary of the main points of Galen's medical theory, and this medical theory is divided by Galen into three parts: body, causes, and signs. By body, Galen means anatomy and physiology. By causes, he means those non-naturals, etiology, plus preventive medicine, depending on what the non-naturals are doing. And the signs are pathology. Galen's book was systematized and condensed in Arabic in the 9th century by Hunayn ibn Ishaq of Baghdad. And this was translated in around the year 1085 into Latin in Italy. Hunayn's name was Latinized as Johannitius, and the book was given a Greek title, Isagoge, or Introduction to Medicine, and it became part of a history's first course pack, if you will, the Articella, which was a collection of texts designed for teaching medicine in an academic context. Now, I want to point out the non-naturals here. The non-naturals are air, food and drink, exercise and rest, repletion and elimination, sleep and wakefulness, and what are called the accidents of the soul, that is, the emotions. Each of these could affect your health. Any of these factors could either change you from being well to being ill, or vice versa. And I want to point out particularly the accidents of the soul, or the emotions, because the emotions were held to have an effect on the humoral system. The humoral system is based on a balance of qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Anger is supposed to make you hot, duh, right? Sadness is supposed to make you cold. Now, that's a very simple sort of, I'm schematizing here enormously. But the emotions were very important, and this is the basis of Peregrine Horton's thesis about medicine without doctors. Put forward in a famous article called A Non-Natural Environment, Medicine Without Doctors in the Medieval European Hospital, published in 2007. Now, Horton's thesis is that the religious character of the high medieval hospital is not at odds with, it's not even complementary to its medical activity. The religious character of the hospital is medical because it provides for the optimal environment of non-naturals. It feeds those who have no means to feed themselves. It keeps them clean, and so on and so forth. But above all, it is in relation to spiritual and emotional states. It gives them the comfort of religion and the comfort of companionship and care. The religious vocation of hospitals is actually intensified, in his argument, by the advent of scholastic medicine via this notion of the non-naturals. So he asks this kind of rhetorical question: what happens if both the notion of medicine without doctors and the medical theory of the emotions are pushed to their limits? The answer suggested below is that in the medieval hospital, medicine without doctors can achieve its fullest expression. It does so under the influence of a vulgarized form of medical theory. In other words, the medical theory that leaks out of the university and into the general populace, especially this idea of non-naturals. The hospital as a non-natural environment is an extreme instance of medicine without doctors. Well, I would like, no, okay, first of all, I want to point out that one of the things that Horden does emphasize in his article, and if we have some time afterwards, I have some extra slides that I can show you about this. This is the Hospital of Beaune that Dr. Weiss was referring to. In Burgundy, you can see that the main Salle des Pauvres does look like a church. In fact, it had a famous altarpiece at the end so that the patients could look at the altarpiece, they could see the Mass being performed, they could see the reserved sacrament at all times, and they could hear the chanting of the Mass, and this was supposed to be as much good for their body as it was for their souls. And Horden has also written a lot about the use of music in medieval hospitals. Well, I want to qualify and expand the Horden thesis a little bit on 2 points. First of all, there were indeed doctors in hospitals, but where they were present, they were operating under the rules of charity. That is, they were operating explicitly without a profit motive, and with their relation to the sick poor very strictly surveilled by the hospital authorities in favor of the poor, and my example is going to be the Great Hospital of Jerusalem. And that even without doctors, the medieval hospital embraced Europe's new gold standard of academic medicine, the medicine of the doctors, in ways that go beyond the non-naturals. And my example here is going to be the work of John of Mirfeld of St Bartholomew's in London. Now, the Hospital of Jerusalem in the 12th century was founded at the time of the First Crusade, early in the 12th century. And it was run by a religious order, the Hospitallers, the ancestor of the more modern Knights of Malta, right, which was recognized in 1113. And this hospital became a kind of model for what a hospital should be. In many ways, it was an ordinary hospital. It did all the things that a hospital should do. It took in the abandoned children of fathers and mothers. It attended to prisoners. It fed the poor. It gave alms to people who were destitute and came to the door. But its primary purpose was to receive sick men and women, and it is accustomed, it says, to keep doctors who have the care of the sick and to make the syrups for the sick and to provide the things that are necessary for the sick. So it explicitly says it has salaried doctors. The reason it has salaried doctors is twofold. First of all, because, and they use the word learned, theoreticorum, learned doctors, provide the best care. Academic medicine is the gold standard, and that is what the hospital wishes to provide. On the other hand, they have to worry about the profit motive. For the sake, then, of avoiding notorious danger, there are in the hospital 4 doctors learned in physica, salaried by the house, so that they not presume any unconventional treatment upon the sick of the hospital. They don't take advantage of the patients to experiment on them, and so that they don't try to sell drugs under the counter and inflated. They get all of their drugs from the hospital stores, and these are carefully monitored. In other words, the doctors are present under very controlled conditions which protect the charitable vocation of the hospital. Now I'm going to fast forward to the 14th century and look at a hospital without doctors, the Hospital of St Bartholomew, London. Now, there are no records of there are records of the intention to provide doctors in hospitals, but doctors in a big city like London could find much better opportunities for profit serving private patients, and most of them didn't care to be salaried by a hospital, although some of them would serve in a hospital pro bono as a gesture of Christian piety. What they were much more interested in obtaining was the service of surgeons, especially for things that were not just like wound care, something a little more elaborate, and in that case they were a little more successful. But I want to look at the work of John of Mirfeld. Now, John of Mirfeld was not a doctor. He was a priest, he was a canon, and he lived at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, and he wrote a very substantial medical handbook for the hospital called the Breviary of Bartholomew, the Breviarium Bartholomei. He wrote this, he basically downloaded an awful lot of university-style medicines in Latin by Avicenna, by Hippocrates, by Galen, by the great medical professors of his day, including Bernard of Gordon. He organized it exactly the way a university handbook of medicine would be organized, that is, from top to toe, head to foot, with separate chapters for fevers and for general diseases like paralysis. And he is extraordinarily up to date. He has, amongst other things, treatment for wounds caused by that wicked modern invention, the gun. He also has sections on the care of women and children. It is, in fact, quite an extraordinary, learned work of medicine by a man with no formal medical training, but who was definitely Latin literate. And he says in his preface that he's writing this book, in fact, to shelter the Hospital of St Bartholomew and its poor clientele from doctors who tend to be rapacious, and you can never tell whether they're any good or not. There's no licensing system in London. There's no licensing at all until 1515 in England. So it seemed very necessary that he should provide, in the form of this book, a manual of medicine that anybody in the hospital could read and use, including a lot of remedies that would be applicable to many diseases that were, quote, easily treatable and not serious, but curable. And I'm going to give you a little example of how he does this. This is his chapter on what we would call pulmonary tuberculosis. He gives a very extensive and a very accurate exposition of differential diagnosis of tuberculosis, how to tell whether a low-grade fever is in fact TB or not. It's all drawn from the Hippocrates, but also from 12th century Salernitan writings. His work on prognosis and treatment is by the very top people of his own day, namely Bernard of Gordon, professor of medicine at Montpellier, and John of Gaddesden. So this is gold standard. This is gold standard medicine. So it shows that St. Bartholomew's and John of Mirfeld absolutely endorse the new university medicine, but it doesn't regard the presence of doctors as necessary in order to reap the benefits of that medicine. It can be done, for the most part, by people who are not necessarily medical professionals. Now, of course, not all hospitals were like St. Bartholomew's. In Italy in particular, doctors were salaried by hospitals, and they were willing to serve because, A, there were a lot more doctors in Italy, so competition in the private sphere was a lot keener, and B, the Italian hospital was, unlike in England, an important element of civic identity and civic pride, and citizen doctors wanted to be seen as contributing to the glory of their city. But that did not ultimately affect the basic reality of doctors on the borders. The medieval hospital is a broad-based social response to the charitable imperative of Christianity that emerged at the time of this medieval Reformation and coincided with medicine's academic turn. This academic turn transformed medicine into a science, which was formally taught. It also produced a self-aware and corporately minded profession of university graduates. Though these men were always in a minority amongst medical health providers, the prestige of the university reinforced their claim that the best medicine was scientific medicine. For only an understanding of the deep workings of the human body and the significance of science could lead to secure diagnosis and prescription of a plan of recovery. Those who founded and ran hospitals embraced this gold standard of medical care completely. What they did not always or necessarily conclude was that best practice required the best practitioner. Once best practice was codified in the standard in writing in university circles, it effectively leaked out of the control of the university-trained practitioner. Anyone who was literate in Latin could read manuals of therapeutics the way John of Mirfeld did, make excerpts from them, translate them into vernacular languages. Pharmaceutical theory and practice may have been an academic subject, but the huge practical literature of materia medica, antidotaria, quid pro quo, and so on, was the domain of the commerce and craft of the apothecary, and had long before and would long be after considered something that anyone, even a layperson, could and should be able to master. Above all, the hospital continued to embody a fundamental Christian distrust of the profit motive inherent in professional medicine and a conviction that non-professionals could provide the gold standard treatments like the Good Samaritan. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wallis, from the electronic age to
the middle age.
So, any questions or comment or?
So was John of Mirfield basically the Google search of the medieval era?
Yeah. I use the word download. I actually use this in an article that I wrote about the way medical compilations were made. Like it's a scrapbook. And my editor for this journal article said, no, you can't use the word download, it's slangy. But that's exactly what he did. He's taking from the printer authorities of his day, and he's cutting and pasting a medical manual for the use of the caregivers at St. Bartholomew, so that they don't need a doctor. They've got all the advantages of the best sort of medical knowledge available, but they could stay, they could stay out of the hands of those rapacious and incompetent physicians. He was not the only one to complain about rapacious and incompetent physicians in 15th century London. There's a collection of letters from a family living north of London called the Pastons, and when the man of the family went to London, his wife wrote to him saying, "I do hope you don't get sick. I live in terror if you've fallen into the hands of those London doctors. They charge a fortune, and you never know what they're going to do." So you could call him the Google of the age. And there's I think a great deal to be learned about medieval habits of compilation. Compilation is the backbone, really, of medieval scholarship, and it is very much like the Google principle. If you do any reading around Wikipedia, or if you research any topic, you'll find that there's actually whole old paragraphs of somebody's post that are incorporated into somebody else's post, that are incorporated into somebody else's article on Wikipedia. And you say, well, they're plagiarizing. Well, no, they're kind of doing the medieval compilation thing, but it's another way of, as it were, diffusing medical knowledge.
Yes, go ahead.
Faye, thank you so much for your talk. So I had a question that I'm not sure if the sources are there to answer, but I wanted to know a bit more about the perspective of patients. And just to elaborate, while you were speaking, I was thinking about Judy Levitt's now classic work on the history of childbirth. Judy Levitt's work on the history of childbirth, and she looks in the 1800s, 1900s, to try to answer the question of why do doctors become more present increasingly at the bedside of women giving delivery. And her question is answered because, according to her, patients want physicians because they believe that the physicians will be able to provide safer births and less painful births. But if we go back to the time that you're investigating, why would someone want necessarily a physician?
In childbirth in particular?
At any point in time. I mean, you sort of talk about the rise of academic medicine, but it's not necessarily that academic medicine that we see in the 1800s.
Right.
They're not licensed.
No.
They're rapacious.
Well, they are licensed in some places. Licensing is very spotty. And there are some cities like Paris that are very heavily controlled, and there's some places like London that are totally uncontrolled. Why would anybody want it? Well, because it is the gold standard of care. Because the university physician represents really the highest level. It's like, we want to see a specialist. Sort of thing. It represents the pinnacle of care. To some extent, it's following fashion. University-trained physicians are in the courts of popes and cardinals and princes and kings. They're there not only to provide healthcare services, but to provide other kinds of advice, including astrological advice and diplomatic services and so on and so forth. So to a large extent, it's following fashion. Certainly the presence of a doctor in the wings during childbirth is something that is spearheaded by royal and aristocratic, and in Italy, patrician, urban patrician women. So it becomes a fashion thing because you can afford the best. And these guys didn't come cheap. The doctors did cost a lot, and there was, not a lot of regulation of doctors' fees. So, to a large extent, it's branding, but also because, and this is something which my students ask, well, why would they go to like a local wise woman or a local healer? Well, sometimes they would if that was what was available. But even in small towns in Europe, you would likely find a physician. Not all physicians are necessarily university graduates. You can practice as a physician without benefit of an MD, but let's put that aside for a second. And I often respond to them, well, if somebody in your family is desperately sick, you're going to sacrifice quite a lot. You're not going to shop around. You're going to try to find the best that you can. You're going to mortgage the farm, if necessary, to get the health care that you want because of this person is dear to you, because it's really important to you. So I think in that sense as well, too, the prestige of academic medicine makes that product all the more desirable even for people of limited means. We can certainly see this in small towns in Catalonia. That was studied by Michael McFaul. Little towns up in the hills, not the big city of Barcelona, where all the doctors want to go because there's plenty of rich people there. Small towns in Catalonia would often try to recruit a university-trained doctor that they would keep on retainer, on salary. And they would have to sign a contract that they would stay in the town for at least a year, and that they would treat the poor gratis, though they could collect fees from people who were not poor and indigent. And they, in other words, these mayors and councillors of these tiny up-country towns in Catalonia knew what the high-end product was, and they were going to try to get it. They were, they were moderately successful, depending on how the market was in Valencia and Barcelona. It was hard to keep, the way it is hard to keep doctors dans les régions in Quebec now, who'd much rather practice in Montreal. So, I think the answer to your question is everybody would want it under certain circumstances, if they could get it. And there was a generalized sort of consensus in later medieval Europe that this was, if you could get it, the best medicine available. A lot of people are willing to go a long way to get it. Now, of course, the doctor in the birthing room, not around in my period, although you do find doctors getting into gynecology, which is a different thing, particularly in Italy.
Thank you very much. I'm actually, this morning, I'm learning a hell of a lot. I have a question which is unclear to me. It appears to me that you presented a view of the status of the physician.
Yeah.
And you differentiated the university-trained physician when the university appears in the 11th century. But what is unclear to me is how is that status different than, say, the Mesopotamian period, the Hammurabi Code? How is it different than Rome? How is it different than the Egyptian physicians in their time? Is there something significant other than the university-based education?
No, the university is the significant thing. The university is a self-governing, permanent academic corporation. It becomes the model for all self-governing, permanent corporations,
Lawyers.
Occupational corporations, including the Corporation des Médecins du Québec,
Elizabeth.
which is a guild. Okay, the university is a guild. It's a guild of teachers. All right? There are no guilds like that in ancient Rome. There are guilds of sorts, but they're kind of almost like a occupational mutual care societies, like burial clubs, in the 19th century. In Mesopotamia, it was totally free market economy. In ancient Egypt, some doctors were bureaucrats of the state, but they had no collective they had no collective agency. And what the university does is give collective agency to teachers as members of the guild, and the university as a guild becomes the template for the professional. This is why medicine as a learned profession is very important, along with law, that it becomes the template for the professional self-governing corporation. In fact, it's the same framework of Roman law that governs them both. So it gives, and also the kind of uniformity and ubiquity of medical education gives a common knowledge base to all of the people who graduate from medical universities throughout Europe. They share a common conception of what science is. They've all read the same books. They all share, as it were, the same database. So that shared knowledge, which you would not find in Rome, Rome has, the doctors of all stripes, of all forms of training or none, right? That common knowledge, common culture, common medical culture, as well as the corporate model of the university provides a totally different framework for the profession.
But despite that, the relationship between the client and the physician seems very similar going all the way back.
Yes.
So it's almost as if the notion of formalizing education, formalizing guilds, formalizing, it's a theme. It's the witch doctor of
No, not
some
really.
degree.
Not really, because, well, I'll tell you an anecdote. Again, it's from about the time of John of Mirfeld, around 1400. There's a doctor named Guillaume Boucher, who is actually the dean of medicine at the University of Paris. And for several months, he was shadowed in his practice by a young student from Germany who kept a diary of his encounter, what it was like to shadow Dr. Boucher. So it's a very unfiltered kind of account of day-to-day encounters between the doctor and his patient. And at one point, Guillaume Boucher is standing at the bedside of a patient and advising him about his diet for his condition. And the patient barks back and said, "Why are you advising me to eat eggs? I thought you told me I had this condition. This condition is supposed to be hot and wet. Shouldn't I be eating something cold and dry? You're supposed to balance out." And Boucher loses it. I mean, he just explodes. He says, "What are you telling me? You're the patient. You're supposed to be, I'm the one who's supposed to have the knowledge." But obviously this patient, who was a private patient, he wasn't in a hospital, felt that he had a certain command of medical theory, and he knew what the basis of Galenic therapeutics was, which is qualitative balance, and he questioned his doctor's sources. And it's interesting, the German student, whose name we don't know, says, "Oh, by the way, the patient got better just fine," at the end. So there is, I think, a difference. It's not just that, the doctor is a witch doctor who has esoteric knowledge. It's not esoteric knowledge. It's not charismatic knowledge. It's not a knack for healing. It is public and scientific knowledge, which in a sense is uncontainable, even in the Middle Ages. And Guillaume Boucher's patient who talks back to him and questions his judgment is a good example of that.
Maybe just to try to give a global historical perspective on this one. We went from a place where in the medieval time, the hospital was a place for the poor, where ideally you wouldn't really go unless you were almost dying or like extremely sick, and where you had no doctors.
Right.
So the system was built around, the hospital was basically not the central part of the system. And then we moved towards something where today the hospital is really at the tip of the pyramid, and where it's a hospital-centered system, up to a certain point, attracting all kinds of patients from clinics and smaller hospitals, etc.
And above all, people with money are ashamed to go to a hospital, the way they would be in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. So today it's the reverse, where we have, and now we're talking about an age of digitalization where it's the reverse part again, going back away from the hospital up to a certain point.
Yeah.
So how do you see the introduction of all of this?
Oh, that would be a whole other lecture, and really for an expert in the 19th century, because this is largely an 18th and 19th century phenomenon, where for various reasons, several things happen, and I'll give you the executive summary here. First of all, it becomes more socially acceptable for people who are not desperately poor to seek medical care in a hospital, especially hospitals that are more specialized. For example, in London, there was the creation of new hospitals specializing in certain diseases like eye diseases, or the diseases of children like Great Ormond Street and that. And these were places that people would go, they would pay to go there, but they would not feel socially ashamed of doing it. With the Industrial Revolution, we find working men's clubs that will actually collect money from their members to pay for the fees of hospitalization if people, for example, need an operation. And as surgery becomes more significant and is transformed in the 19th century, it becomes something which takes place exclusively in hospital, the more technology you have. The hospitals are also taken over by the doctors. It is not the lay confraternities or the church or whatever that runs the hospitals. It is increasingly the physicians themselves. Now, this is a process that takes place at different cadences in different parts of the world. It's often been said that the First World War in England was a watershed because people of all social classes in the First World War were serving in the army, and many of them wound up in the same military hospitals, side by side with other people from different classes, and they became kind of used to the idea of the hospital as a public space, and with the introduction of hospital insurance around the time of the First World War. But if I can evoke Sir William Osler again. Sir William Osler, when he died, was Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford. He lived about a block away from the Radcliffe Infirmary, which was the premier scientific hospital of the Faculty of Medicine of Oxford. During his final illness, he was not only cared for at home, he was operated on at home because somebody of his social class would not be operated on in a hospital. He's the most famous physician in the English-speaking world. And it's not like he doesn't have the resources at his doorstep, but the hospital took a long time to shed its identity as the hospitium, the xenodocium, the space for the destitute.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have another question, which refers to the location of the expert knowledge. Maybe that's also a theme that's coming up here. Whether expert knowledge is actually located in the person of the doctor, or it's in the scriptures, and which are then accessible to people who are not that person.
I think it depends on what expert knowledge. In London, they were much more desperate to try to get a surgeon on staff because there is specific craft knowledge about things like removing a projectile from somebody's body or reducing a dislocation that can't be done by an amateur. On the other hand, the literature of recipes for making up drugs is totally democratic. You can find it not just in manuals like John of Mirfeld's Breviarium, but even, as Olivia Weiser will probably point out, in household books that were used by the lady of the house in her kitchen and her private distillery, even. So it depends on what expert knowledge. Pharmacy, completely, and for a long time, really, in the hands of people who were by no means professional. Something like surgery. Now, where medicine fell was interesting because doctors don't put their hands on people the way surgeons do. On the other hand, their knowledge is not quite as democratic as that of drug recipes, but it sort of falls between the two stools, and it seems as if in many situations they felt they could do very well without doctors. On the other hand, the Great Hospital of Jerusalem felt that it was important to have theoretically trained doctors because their mission was to provide the very best, but they hedged their doctors around with a lot of caveats.
Maybe one more questions or comments?
How effective were the hospitals?
Well, what do you mean by effective?
You come in as a patient, you leave the hospital not in a bad.
Nobody-
The first picture.
Yeah, nobody kept statistics, and also the rate of cure was not the measuring stick. The measuring stick was how well they fulfilled the works of mercy.
You talked about standards, the golden standards.
The gold standard was that they would provide the kind of medical care that was deemed to be the best. In other words, the kind that was promulgated by academic medicine. But they never kept statistics. I don't think that was really their criterion of success. What is efficacy very much depends on cultural norms. And what is efficacious in terms of that first image I showed you, was being able to die in comfort and peace and be given a decent Christian burial instead of dying on the streets. You know, that was considered efficacious, is to be cared for in your last days and be given a proper Christian burial. Or to be able to give, you know, if you're an unwed mother, to be able to give birth in some place that's clean and cared for, that has, you know, experienced women around you, and have your child baptized. So that was considered what was efficacious.
Olivia's been waiting.
Okay, I guess very quickly, and I think, I apologize if this was your bigger point, but it seems like the way people characterize these physicians was kind of contradictory.
Mhm.
Gold standard, they're prestigious,
Mhm.
the best of the best, responding to the first question, the earlier question. And yet they were also characterized as rapacious, as
Yeah.
profiting from the suffering of other people, as motivated by profit. And I wonder if it's that contradiction which is reflective in the sources that you showed us, that they're kind of on the border, they're these marginal figures, they're in, that maybe it is that position, that marginal position within the hospital is reflective of this more contradictory.
Oh, for sure. Look at Chaucer's portrait of the doctor in the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales. Yes, he's super learned, you know, he's read John of Gaston, you know, and all those other people, but he made a killing during the Black Death. Yeah, literally, you know, he made a lot of money, and gold, he says, is a sovereign remedy, because they used to put flakes of gold in cordials that were given to the rich and famous, and gold he loved very much. You know, so yeah, there is this kind of ambivalence about the doctor. The profit motive was always the hot button, and later medieval theologians tried to kind of work around it by saying that the doctor deserves his fee, not because he's selling healing. Only God can heal, really, and only God gives the doctor the capacity to heal. But the doctor deserves his fee as compensation for those years that he spent getting educated as a doctor. It compensates him for all of the effort that he's put into his learning and to keeping up with his learning as well, too, because a good doctor was supposed to keep up with the literature, okay? But they're trying to kind of wiggle their way around the issue of selling healing, which was never totally resolved.
From an ethical perspective, I think it's important to put into perspective the fact that the same people that accuse the physicians of getting money for nothing were charging funds to go to heaven after death. So the whole monetary aspect of professions, of church life, strikes me as being below par compared to our standards now. So
Yeah, well,
it's like
they had their workarounds too.
Everybody had workarounds. They still do now, and we still do.
So we're going to stop here and we're going to break for lunch. So thank you very much, Dr. Wallis, for your excellent and thank you for letting me chair this morning's session, which was extremely interesting. So I suppose we're going to convene again at 2 o'clock.
So, you have to do that, doctor.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Most important
some of
thing.
the doctors, everybody's money.
Yes.